CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories: dozens of patients, including premature babies, are said to have died after fuel ran out at Gaza's biggest hospital. Our other headlines: a familiar face in Downing Street as former Prime Minister David Cameron returns as Foreign Secretary in a surprise cabinet reshuffle. And moving away from competition and conflict, China sets out its goals for its future relationship with the United States ahead of a meeting between President Xi and President Biden. Dozens of patients at Gaza's biggest hospital, including several premature babies, are said to have died after operations were suspended when fuel ran out on Saturday. The World Health Organization says the situation at Al-Shifa Hospital is dire and perilous. Gaza's health ministry says Israeli tanks and snipers have surrounded the complex. Israel claims Hamas militants have been hiding out at Al-Shifa and other medical facilities throughout the Gaza Strip, which the armed group denies. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Noor Harazin in central Gaza. Noor, what's the latest on Al-Shifa and Gaza's other hospitals?
Well, now we can say that most of Gaza's hospitals are now out of service. Specifically, those are located in northern Gaza and central Gaza City. We're talking about Kamal Udwan Hospital, the Indonesian Hospital, the Al-Shifa Hospital, the Al-Quds Hospital also. And just a few hours ago, the Israeli planes actually targeted the Al-Khidma Al-Amma Hospital, which is also located in central Gaza. So we're talking about mostly all of the biggest hospitals, biggest clinics in the Gaza Strip. What is happening now in Al-Shifa Hospital is actually the situation is worsening. We're talking about more than 30,000 people that are besieged inside the hospital and they cannot get in or out. According to the Palestinian medical sources, they said that 15 people died because of the lack of fuel and electricity. Among them are premature babies. The doctors inside the Al-Shifa Hospital also said that there is more than 150 bodies that are still in the backyard of the hospital, and they cannot even move around to bury those bodies, even though that a few days ago actually they said that they will bury them inside the hospital. However, because of the continuous firing and battle on the ground between Hamas and the Israeli forces, they cannot move around. At the same time, the Israeli warplanes targeted several apartments and residential towers and buildings that are surrounding the Al-Shifa Hospital.
Elsewhere, hundreds of thousands of civilians are believed to remain in the northern part of Gaza despite Israel's order to leave.
Well, yes, that's true, especially if we're talking about areas like Jabalia refugee camp and Beit Hanun and also Ash-Shuja'iyya. Those places are densely populated areas. The people there, most of the people there are actually farmers, and most of the people there refused to leave their homes, saying that this looks like a second Palestinian Nakba and they should not leave their homes. And also, regarding the situation here in southern Gaza, the situation is also deteriorating. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Actually, the UN said that the estimated number is more than 1.2 million people that fled their homes from northern Gaza and from central Gaza City to here, southern Gaza. The situation in southern Gaza is deteriorating. Actually, the markets are empty. There's nothing in the markets, no water, no food, no canned food. Even the necessities, if we're talking about flour and rice and lentils, all of these things are not available in the markets here in Gaza, adding the fact that these people have nowhere to go. They are actually taking shelter inside the hospitals.
Noor, thank you for that. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Gaza. The United Nations is holding a day of mourning to honour its 101 workers killed in Gaza since the start of this conflict. Flags at various UN compounds were lowered to half-mast, and workers at the headquarters in Geneva observed a minute's silence. It's the largest death toll of humanitarian workers in the organisation's 78-year history. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Sarah Coates. Sarah, fighting concentrated in a tightening circle around Al-Shifa Hospital. What's the latest you're hearing from Israel on its ground offensive?
Hi there, Jamie. Well, look, the IDF has just in the last few minutes come out to say that it has just killed 21 Hamas operatives that it says began firing at troops from inside the Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City, saying that it then ran out, these people embedding themselves with civilians. It says they were using RPGs to fire at Israeli troops before air support then fired on them and killed them. Now, look, this is the IDF says so far since this ground operation began, Jamie, it has taken out 4,300 targets inside the Gaza Strip, also saying that 300 of those were these tunnels, which we know run right underneath Gaza. And it also says that right now its focus is on the Shati refugee camp. It says earlier today it destroyed a number of booby-trapped Hamas facilities. These include what it says are weapons storage facilities and also command centres, while adding it raided the home of a senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander, with troops saying that they found a cache of weapons inside a child's bedroom in that home. Now, look, all of this is still coming at a very heavy cost to Israel. As of the last few minutes, the death toll on the Israeli side has gone up to 44 soldiers. We do know a number of funerals are being held around Israel today as calls just continue, Jamie, from the international community for a ceasefire, for a pause in fighting and for more humanitarian efforts in the Strip.
And there's been a renewed exchange of fire at the Israel-Lebanon border.
Yeah, you're right. Very worrying escalation on that northern border there with Israel yesterday. Probably the biggest flare-up since all of this began. 21 Israeli civilians were actually wounded when anti-tank missiles were fired over the border. Israel returning fire, and we can tell you now in the last few minutes, Israel has said that one of those people who were wounded has now died from his injuries. Now, overnight or early this morning, Israeli warplanes struck a number of targets inside southern Lebanon. But look, alert sirens have been continuing to ring out on that border throughout the day. There was a hostile aircraft. We do understand that it was a number of drones that were sent over. A couple of those were fired on by Israeli forces. But this is certainly a situation that nobody wants, with Hezbollah entering the fray even further, given it is heavily backed by Iran and is thought to have sophisticated weapons that could potentially overwhelm Israel's air defences. Now, we heard from the aerospace commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Iran's Revolutionary Guards, coming out a little earlier to say that the war has expanded and now includes Lebanon, adding that Iran is ready for every scenario. So, look, this is certainly a front up there that the Israeli military is keeping an extremely close eye on, and it says it is ready for every possibility.
Sarah, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Sarah Coates in Israel. Well, the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine are set to dominate the talks between EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. Let's talk to our correspondent there, Alex Cadier. Alex, EU countries trying to strike what must be a tricky diplomatic balance when it comes to the conflicts in the Middle East. What have they had to say so far?
Yeah, that's right, Jamie. Striking a balance and agreeing a common position among 27 EU member states on not particularly contentious issues is difficult enough. This is the most contentious issue, and as we've seen since the beginning of this conflict, the EU has struggled to find a unified position. What we do know they're unified behind, they condemned Hamas for what they said was using hospitals and civilians as human shields. They also urged Israel to have maximum restraint in order to protect civilian lives in Gaza, trying to find that balance between supporting Israel's right to defend itself, but also wanting Israel to do more to minimize those civilian casualties in Gaza, trying to strike that balance. You have countries like Spain and Ireland who want to put more pressure on Israel, and on the other side you have Germany, Austria and others more reluctant to overtly criticize Israel. That's the balance the ministers are trying to strike. We know that they have we've seen growing pressure. President Macron of France just last week finally, for the first time, calling for a ceasefire, or at least saying that those humanitarian pauses should build up to a ceasefire. Well, just today, Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, had slightly different things to say. Let's have a listen to what she said.
I've just come straight from the Middle East on my third trip since the terrible Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th. The situation in the region is at breaking point. The rifts seem to be getting deeper. We can feel in all places how great the despair is in the Middle East, how much the people in Gaza are suffering, how much the people in the West Bank are suffering, how much the people in Israel are suffering, who still don't know where their abducted children are, their abducted wives, and who are exposed to non-stop terrorist attacks.
And the point there made by Annalena Baerbock, that balanced view, she then went on to say that calling for a ceasefire is not the right way forward, because the question for the foreign minister of Germany, is who will assure Israel's security in the time of a ceasefire? What will happen to those victims, civilians that were kidnapped by Hamas that are still in Gaza? Those are the big questions. And so that shows the division between some European states calling for a ceasefire and Germany still a little bit more reluctant to do so.
And does the focus on the Middle East mean the EU's attention has perhaps moved away from supporting Ukraine?
Well, it's very much an effort on behalf of the EU states to make sure it doesn't. They are trying very much to keep the focus on both. As one minister said, one EU diplomat told me the EU can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have a statement from Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, saying that they passed a message of united support, all 27 ministers, to their Ukrainian counterpart, Foreign Minister Kuleba, saying that Ukraine is the EU's top priority. Now, that is a very clear statement of intent from the EU's top diplomat. There are also wranglings behind the scenes as to more long-term funding for Ukraine. There was a plan for 20 billion euros over 4 years, and there was a little bit of a reluctance amongst the member states because 4 years is quite a long commitment and they don't necessarily know where things will be in those 4 years. That might be tweaked into 5 billion euro payments year after year to allow for more flexibility in that planning. But certainly they are trying to find ways to continue to support Ukraine and trying to find the technical ways to do so. But the statements are very clear. They are not forgetting about Ukraine and they will not abandon their neighbour.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, back to Downing Street. He led the UK for 6 years. Now David Cameron is making a surprise return to frontline politics.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
For China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us
is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Dozens of patients, including premature babies, are said to have died after fuel ran out at Gaza's biggest hospital. The former British Prime Minister David Cameron is back in Downing Street after the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's surprise decision to appoint Cameron as Foreign Secretary. That role has just been vacated by James Cleverly, who moves over to head up the Home Office, the Interior Office. This follows the sacking of Suella Braverman after a week of political turmoil, which saw her undermine the Prime Minister's authority and make controversial remarks about the London police force and pro-Palestinian demonstrators. Let's talk to our correspondent, Paul Hawkins, watching the comings and goings in Downing Street. Paul, Cameron back as Foreign Secretary. What change might this make to Britain's view on the world stage?
Yeah, well, that would be the interesting question, Jamie, especially when it comes to China and the European Union, because when David Cameron was Prime Minister up until 2016, now, the relationship between China and the UK was much warmer. He hosted a state visit by Xi Jinping, even sharing a pint with him, a pint of beer, and talking about a golden era in relations. Now, Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister last year, said that golden era was over, and that they needed, that when it came to economic ties between the two countries, he even described that as being naive. So David Cameron's worldview on China, squaring that with UK foreign policy at the moment on China, that's going to be one interesting development. And then also, of course, the relationship between the UK and the European Union. Now, David Cameron, many people consider to be the starting point of Brexit, because he was the one that raised the question in the first place, that started the process of the UK having a referendum, which he then went on to lose. But he was lobbying for the UK to remain in the European Union, so he is seen as pro-European. And in terms of the relationship between the UK and the EU, it has improved under Rishi Sunak. Look at the Windsor framework, and he's seen by many people in Brussels as a pro-European voice, and certainly that will help to improve the relationship there. So those are the two big areas. And then, of course, in terms of how much the UK spends on its overseas aid, David Cameron believed in 0.7% of UK's GDP, spending that on foreign aid. Rishi Sunak has brought that down to 0.5%. So that's going to be another interesting conversation that the two will have now that David Cameron is surprisingly now the UK's Foreign Secretary.
And all this, of course, follows a week of political turmoil. Just remind us how we got here.
Well, really, it's about events in the Middle East and the ripple effect from that October the 7th attack by Hamas on Israel, which then led to those Palestinian protests around the world. And the Home Secretary, who's known as the Interior Minister in other countries, Suella Braverman, how she described the policing of those protests last week. In a newspaper article, she described the police as potentially having favourites and essentially questioning their bias, describing the protests as well as hate marches. Earlier in the week, she described the homelessness in the UK as a lifestyle choice, and it was that kind of controversial language that had put her in the spotlight and brought many people, many critics of the government, say, well, of Rishi Sunak, to say, well, maybe she needs to be sacked as Home Secretary. They were talking about a cabinet reshuffle anyway. There is an autumn statement coming up by the UK government where it basically, it's kind of like a budget announcement where it talks about the UK's finances and how it's going to spend its money. Ahead of that statement, there was always some talk that there was going to be a reshuffle, but the Home Secretary, the now ex-Home Secretary's language has kind of facilitated that process. She was sacked this morning as Home Secretary. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, now moves to Home Secretary, as you say, and now David Cameron, big surprise. No one thought that was going to happen. Former UK Prime Minister, now the Foreign Secretary. And in terms of how that happens, for those who don't know, those political geeks, no, he's not a serving MP. What they've had to do is they've had to fast-track his application to the House of Lords. So he's now become a baron, and through that process he can now become the UK's Foreign Secretary.
Paul, thank you for that. Our correspondent Paul Hawkins in Downing Street. President Xi Jinping heads to San Francisco on Tuesday, where he'll meet US President Joe Biden. Their first face-to-face talks in a year will be closely watched for signs that relations might be warming. It'll take place during a gathering of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, where regional leaders discuss trade. US officials have said nothing will be off the table when Xi and Biden meet. China says neither country has the right to interfere in each other's internal matters, and that competition is counterproductive.
China has consistently approached its relations with the U.S. based on the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, as proposed by President Xi Jinping. Competition between major powers goes against the prevailing trend of the times and fell short in addressing challenges confronting the U.S. and the world.
Well, San Francisco is home to the second largest Chinese-American community in the United States. So what will the event mean for people living there? Our correspondent Xu Xinchen reports.
The historic Klamath Ferry Boat, built in 1925, is now restored and the headquarters for the Bay Area Council along the San Francisco waterfront. That's where I met Kevin Xu, the co-chair of the host committee for this year's APEC meeting.
I would say this is a wonderful opportunity for the city itself to really experience such a big international event since the establishment of the UN. Because we know in the city needs some kind of way to bring the vitality back.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is scheduled to meet here with his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden later this week. San Francisco has the second largest Chinese-American community in the country. California Governor Gavin Newsom recently paid a visit to China, and President Xi Jinping also met with the governor. And during their meeting, the Chinese president said that the foundation and hope for China-U.S. relations lies with the people, and the future lies with the youth. And of course, the vitality lies with subnational entities. So what's your take on this remark?
By the end of the day is how will people took those message back? How will people actually take home the information? And I would say I will recall a word from Governor Newsom during his visit in China. He said San Francisco has the first Chinatown being built in the United States.
Yes.
And by having this opportunity to invite delegations, especially Chinese delegation, to come to visit the city of SF, you basically have an opportunity to show them around the Chinatown and how Chinese people live here and how they carry their culture from their mother country to the U.S. And therefore you see a transformation, but also another way to reflecting inclusivities.
Yes.
Inclusivity of culture.
Yes.
That people from China actually build their Chinatown based on their vision. But how does Chinatown become a strong bond, just like the bridge we see, that actually having a strong hold of the people, especially vitalities from the local.
30 years ago in Seattle, the 1993 APEC Leaders Declaration, the U.S. was an advocate for building an open multilateral trade system and strengthening cooperation. Since then, there's been a growing protectionist sentiment. Now, with eyes off the world are on San Francisco, this is one of the most important gatherings of global leaders this year. It's a golden opportunity for the whole city to shine and use this as an opportunity for economic change. Xu Xinchen, CGTN, San Francisco.
Now, one has been billed as the greatest threat of our time, the other one of the most under threat ecosystems. But thanks to scientists in California, artificial intelligence is helping to save coral reefs by mapping them. And the results have given climate scientists an unexpected glimmer of hope. Our correspondent Francis Kuo reports.
They're nicknamed the rainforests of the sea, coral reefs, bursting with a brilliance of colors. They cover less than 1% of the sea floor, but comprise complex and diverse underwater communities. home to 25% of all marine life.
A fascinating ecosystem on the planet.
Stuart Sandin is a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. He's been studying coral reefs for 25 years.
If you jump in the water in one location of a coral reef, you're likely to see hundreds of species of fish, hundreds of species of corals, and countless number of little invertebrates. Just that vast diversity packed into a tiny place makes it just a bastion of life.
And a crucial buffer against erosion and storm surges.
That coral ecosystem also serves as a break from the intensity, the strength, and sometimes the overwhelming power of the ocean. Breaking waves, dispersing that energy, and protecting coastal ecosystems.
But warming temperatures are threatening these valuable and vulnerable colonies, causing the corals to expel the symbiotic algae living in their tissues and lose their bright colors.
The corals are having some trouble adapting to the heat. The animals that live in the coral reefs with no corals have no home. So there's a big worry out there about what the future of coral reefs will look like.
What that future looks like is the vision behind the 100 Island Challenge, an initiative run by Sandin and his team in a collaboration with 19 countries around the world.
These two kind of have similar structures.
And we got to see it with our own eyes. In this lab, coral reefs from 100 islands across the Caribbean, Indian, and Pacific Oceans come to us.
How do we actually drain the oceans to reveal what is out there?
Answering that question is another member of the team, Falco Kuster, an engineering professor at the university. He's using artificial intelligence to develop algorithms to analyze and identify nearly 1 million corals across the 100 islands. It works by stitching smaller digital snapshots together to build these stunning 3D models.
Capturing 1 million plus point for a single square meter, rather than the 10 points that we would get if we go to our online Google Maps.
That resolution allows the scientists to monitor over time and in minute detail how corals are growing, shrinking, living, and dying, a far cry from traditional methods.
1 or 2 people would get in the water, they would observe things, write something down on a piece of paper, underwater paper, and then record that and then create a graph and tell the story of what they observed.
The technology has been transformative, allowing the team to see coral reefs in a whole new light.
It's like identifying your favorite child, right? There's really no such thing. Every single one of these sites has a truly unique story to tell.
The stories also revealed a stunner, an unusually positive anecdote in the climate change narrative.
We're actually finding that there's some corals that are suffering the effects of climate change, and that community of corals grows back stronger. It grows back with more of an ability to face high temperatures than their predecessors.
The team is now investigating why some corals are so resilient and what that says about the future health of these kaleidoscopic communities amid a changing planet.
If we lose them, we lose a part of our humanity. We have to build a new relationship with our natural resources if we want to maintain some of this beauty, this wonder, and the productivity. So we have this unique opportunity to think about how the world around us has changed, and more importantly, how do we navigate it for the next generation so that we preserve the things that are important to us as humans and as a society.
Frances Coe, CGTN, San Diego.
The headlines again. Dozens of patients, including premature babies, are said to have died after fuel ran out at Gaza's biggest hospital. Our other headlines: a familiar face in Downing Street as former Prime Minister David Cameron returns as Foreign Secretary in a surprise cabinet reshuffle. And moving away from competition and conflict, China sets out its goals for its future relationship with the United States ahead of a meeting between President Xi and President Biden. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.